Here, I can go, yes. Subtitles by Little.
To the forest, to the forest.
Right now in Russia, the Omsk oil refinery is on fire, which is located 2,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. And it was the only major oil refinery that the Ukrainian armed forces had not attacked on Russian territory until today. In Siberia, for the first time, an air raid alert was declared due to a Ukrainian drone attack 3,500 kilometers away. The Kremlin said there had been an attack on the Kursk nuclear power plant, and the Ukrainian defense forces added that today they also carried out a massive strike on the Kerch oil terminal in occupied Crimea and attacked 2 tankers in the Black Sea that were trying to bring gasoline to the peninsula. Meanwhile, the commander of the Unmanned Systems Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Madyar, stated that in just the first 6 days of July, Ukraine struck 37 energy facilities in Crimea and Donbass. In this way, Ukraine struck back at Russia in response to its barbaric attacks on Kyiv. Donald Trump today acknowledged that the pressure from Ukraine's defense forces on Russia is working, and according to him, Vladimir Putin is indeed looking for ways to enter into negotiations. Sources add that as early as tomorrow at the NATO summit in Ankara, Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky will discuss how else they can put pressure on the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, so that he finally stops the war. But the Kremlin, it seems, is ready to keep fighting. Russian military correspondents have started to write en masse about preparations for a large-scale mobilization and even the closure of Russia's borders as early as October. That is, after the elections to the State Duma. But experts also suggest that all the rumors about mobilization in Russia may simply be a form of blackmail against the European Union and the entire NATO bloc. My name is Oleg, Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss all these topics together. That was a short preamble. Now let's break down each piece of news. But before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and leave any comment under this video. I would be very grateful to you for that.
Damn, they finally reached us too. I hope they won't come again. Well, it's really booming here. I was just pulling up here. There was a huge blast. It was scary.
As of this moment, there is officially not a single major oil refinery left in Russia that hasn't been attacked by Ukraine. On Monday, July 6, during the day, Ukrainian drones attacked the Omsk oil refinery, the most powerful in Russia and the last of the major oil refineries that had not yet been damaged by Ukrainian drone raids. This was the giant that at least somewhat helped offset Russia's fuel shortage after the strikes on the other oil refineries in the country. But now it has finally been hit as well. And interestingly, OSINT analysts write that, well, it seemed obvious that the next one to be attacked would be the Omsk oil refinery, because it's the only one that hasn't been attacked yet. And you would think that this plant should be protected as much as possible, but when the drones got there, it turned out there was practically no protection at all. By the way, this points to the fact that Putin has huge problems with air defense systems. It's important to note that this facility, the Omsk oil refinery, is located thousands of kilometers from the border with Ukraine. An impact was recorded on the territory of the plant, which caused a large-scale fire. And now, let's look at the target. Drones of the Special Operations Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine traveled up to 3,000 kilometers, meaning along the entire flight path, 3,000 kilometers. This is the deepest long-range strike on Russian territory since the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. According to the director of Firepoint, Stillerman, Ukrainian soldiers struck with FP-1 drones which can reach targets located up to 3,400 kilometers from the state border. The plant in Omsk is the most powerful oil refinery in all of Russia, capable of processing almost 22 million tons of oil annually. It has one of the highest refining depths in Russia, about 99%, which means it is also the most technologically advanced plant in Russia. The enterprise plays a significant role in supplying the Russian occupation army. The plant produces aviation kerosene, diesel fuel, high-octane gasoline, as well as lubricants and petrochemical products. In addition, it is among the top 10 largest gasoline producers in the Russian Federation, and it was the last one that hadn't been hit yet. Well, now it has. After the initial assessment of the impact, OSINT analysts indicate that the drones hit their target. At the Omsk Oil Refinery, the primary oil processing unit aft was hit. 11 with a capacity of almost 8.5 million tons per year, which provides about 40% of the plant's capacity. In addition, there is now information that the AVT-10 unit has also been damaged, which means that the plant is essentially on the verge of shutting down. According to eyewitnesses, the plant was attacked by 7 drones and none of them were shot down by Russian air defense. Although the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that most of the drones were actually shot down and only their debris fell on the plant's territory. But eyewitness footage captured direct hits by the drones themselves, not just their debris.
Subtitles created by there's already a lot more there now.
Why are they all here, guys?
We're sitting. We're sitting. Sorry if we hit anyone. To the forest?
That's right.
Unbelievable. Smart, huh?
The damn factory is blowing up over there.
The strike on the Omsk Oil Refinery was the deepest in a series of raids on oil refineries, which caused oil refining in Russia to fall to its lowest levels since the early 2000s, say. And regions from Kamchatka to Kaliningrad have faced a fuel crisis. In October of last year, the Tyumen oil refinery, located 2,000 kilometers from the border, was hit. At the beginning of 2026, the Ukhta oil refinery was hit, and it's 1,750 kilometers from the border. In May, the Kurishi oil refinery, Kurishi Nefteorg Synthes, in the Leningrad region, with a capacity of 21 million tons per year, were attacked. That is, it's in second place right after the Omsk plant. Also in May, the Ryazan oil refinery, with a capacity of 17 million tons per year, was attacked. In June, Nizhny Novgorod's Nefteorg Synthes of Lukoil, with a capacity of 16 million tons per year, was hit. And Taneco, this is the largest Taneco plant. The Nizhnekamsk oil refinery has a capacity of 12.5 million tons. The Yaroslavl oil refinery, which ranks 6th in capacity, has 15 million tons per year. It was attacked in May and then again on July 6th. The Volgograd oil refinery, that's 15 million tons per year. It stopped on June 1, again because of a drone attack. The Perm oil refinery, Permnefteorg Synthes, was damaged at the end of April, and it became famous for the oil rain, which occurred in the region after the fire at the facility, the Moscow oil refinery. With a processing capacity of 12 million tons per year, it stopped in June, and its repairs could last until 2027. This was reported by Reuters sources. Reuters. The Tuapse oil refinery, which rounds out this top 10 in Russia, became the record holder for the number of attacks sustained. It was attacked 7 times. As a result, after the plant in Omsk was hit today. There are no oil refineries left in Russia from the top 10 largest that haven't been attacked this year, and as you understand, these attacks will continue. And it's obvious that sooner or later, all of Russia's oil industry will simply be destroyed completely. Well, unless Putin comes to his senses and agrees to negotiations. But, as it turned out, this was just the beginning of today's attacks, and the Omsk oil refinery was only one of the targets. On the night of July 6th, Ukrainian forces also struck the T Terminal 1. This is one of the largest complexes for transshipment of light petroleum products in occupied Crimea. As stated by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, quote, the facility provides reception, storage, and shipment of gasoline, diesel fuel, and other petroleum products, including to supply occupation forces in southern Ukraine. This terminal is located in Kerch, and according to the Security Service of Ukraine, as a result of the strike, a tank with petroleum products and a pumping station were damaged. According to outdated, I emphasize, data, this facility is capable of handling up to 1.2 million tons of light petroleum products and 720,000 tons of liquefied hydrocarbon gas per year. These are the figures that were recorded before the occupation. Accordingly, the Russians tried to modernize this facility, and most likely the current data would indicate larger volumes. Therefore, shutting down this terminal is very risky for the Russians. In addition, the Security Service of Ukraine and the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, they announced successful strikes on the Slavneft oil refinery and the linear production at the dispatch station in Yaroslavl, as well as on the oil loading terminal at the seaport of Vysotsk and the Novatek Ust-Luga plant in the Leningrad region. In Vysotsk, 2 oil loading stands were put out of operation and 3 oil product tanks were damaged. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that by early July, Ukrainian strikes had disabled targets since June.
Украинские удары вывели из строя
about 43% of Russia's oil refining capacity. Just in the last month, more than 60 tanks for storing oil and petroleum products were destroyed or critically damaged. In addition, today, the commander of the Unmanned Systems Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Robert Magyar Brody, stated that since the beginning of July, that is, in just 6 days so far, Ukrainian drones have struck 37 energy facilities in Crimea and Donbass. As a result of the strikes, the so-called authorities admitted to a total blackout. And next, I will quote Magyar. Crimea's power switch gave out for the 38th time in 6 days of July thanks to the Unmanned Systems Forces. The occupiers of Crimea admitted to a blackout in all cities and districts of the southern coast of Crimea and in Simferopol. Between July 1 and 5, the Unmanned Systems Forces drones struck 37 energy facilities in Crimea and the southern occupied territories. But that's not all. On the night of July 6, Ukrainian drones struck 2 gasoline tankers in the Sea of Azov that were heading to Crimea from the Taganrog area. We're talking about Shadow Fleet River C-class tankers called Kapitan Barman and Sanar 4, each of which, according to the head of the SBS, was carrying 7,000 tons of fuel. And judging by the published video, the drones targeted the control cabins of both vessels. And let me remind you that earlier, Russian President Vladimir Putin stated that Crimea's monthly need for gasoline is 70,000 tons of fuel per month. That is, it's about 2,000 to 2,300 tons per day, and he promised to ensure the region's supply. And apparently, this attempt to deliver gasoline to Crimea by tankers was exactly that attempt to establish gasoline supplies to Crimea. But we see that his supply plan failed, and things did not go according to plan. And so,
Kiev requested an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council to discuss the Russian attacks on residential buildings there. In Kiev.
And so the Kremlin realized that they needed to overshadow this topic with something even more sensational.
And so that at the UN Security Council they would discuss not the strikes on residential buildings, but something even scarier.
Let's put that in quotation marks.
And so, apparently realizing that even attacks on Kyiv no longer help distract Russians from the strikes on Russian territory and on the occupied territories of Ukraine, the Kremlin came up with a new scare tactic and a new attempt to divert the attention of our Western partners. And this is also happening against the backdrop of Kyiv requesting an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council to discuss the Russian attacks on residential buildings in Kyiv. And so the Kremlin figured out that they needed to overshadow this topic with something even more sensational, so that at the UN Security Council they would discuss not the strikes on residential buildings, but something scarier. Let's put that word in quotes. Today, the Director General of Rosatom, the second power unit under construction, was hit at the Kursk nuclear power plant 2 in the city of Kurchatov. Next, a drone struck the cooling tower of the second unit under construction at the Kursk nuclear power plant. Also last night, enemy drones were detected in the areas of the Leningrad and Smolensk nuclear power plants. The nuclear industry of the Russian Federation is experiencing the consequences of attacks by the armed forces of Ukraine. And now the governor of the Kursk region, Alexander Kinstein, reported that air defense forces overnight suppressed and destroyed 12 Ukrainian drones that were flying specifically towards Kurchatov, where the nuclear power plant is located. According to him, despite one drone hitting the target, the operation of the plant was not disrupted, and there are no negative consequences for the environment or people. And I should note here that the Kursk nuclear power plant 2 is being built to replace the existing Kursk nuclear power plant. The decision to build it was made in 2013. Construction of the first power unit began in 2018 and the second in 2019. In April 2026, Rosatom put power unit number 1 with a capacity of 1,253 MW into commercial operation. The construction of all 4 power units of this station is planned to be fully completed by 2035. And now the Kremlin has decided to use the scare tactic of a nuclear disaster again to shift the focus away from its attacks on residential buildings in Ukraine, not just in Kyiv, but also near the nuclear power plants. Sumy region, Kharkiv region, the entire south of Ukraine, Odessa region, Zaporizhzhia region. In fact, many regions are coming under these attacks. Yes, always the nuclear power plant. The Kremlin, the nuclear power plant. The Kremlin has decided to use the nuclear scare again. Odessa region, Zaporizhzhia region. In fact, many regions are coming under these attacks. Ballistic missiles are hitting Kyiv after all. It's the capital of Ukraine. But we shouldn't forget that every single day, the Russians are striking all the border and frontline cities in Ukraine with air bombs and the same kind of ballistic missiles. That's why it's obvious that this is the topic they were planning to discuss and will discuss at the UN Security Council meeting. But the Russians, and I'm calling it right now, at this meeting they will say, this is nothing yet. But the Ukrainians are striking at nuclear power plants. How long will this go on? And not just one, but 3 at once in the Kursk, Leningrad, and Smolensk regions. Well, it's obvious that Putin is not doing all this for nothing. And again, besides the issue of the UN Security Council, there's another topic here. It is known that tomorrow in Ankara at the NATO summit there will be a meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump. This meeting has already been confirmed by White House spokesperson Anna Key, and as stated by the White House, Trump feels an urgent need to end Russia's war against Ukraine. The US president plans to discuss ways to end the war with Zelensky at the NATO summit. Trump basically needs some kind of victory after the failure with Iran, because the congressional elections are already very close. And obviously, something needs to be presented as the victory of peacemaker Donald Trump. Because it's not certain yet that by the elections this temporary agreement between the US and Iran will turn into a permanent one. That's far from certain, but some kind of success story is needed. And a White House official told Reuters that after talks in Ankara with Zelensky, Trump is expected to contact the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, and that raises the question, with what attitude is Trump approaching these negotiations? Let me remind you, earlier, specifically on July 4th, Trump had already spoken with Vladimir Putin by phone. And here it's important to note that after the conversation, Vladimir Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, stated that Putin, and I quote, described to Donald Trump the real situation on the battlefield, where Russian fighters are advancing along the entire line of contact. So now it's clear why Putin made up this fake capture of Konstantinovka right now. Exactly for this date. to show Trump, look, we're capturing Ukrainian territory just like that, snapping up city after city. So just put some pressure on this Zelensky already, let him surrender, because we're going to win anyway, supposedly. I'll continue Ushakov's quote. Putin and Trump discussed Ukraine, including in the context of the US president's plans to participate in the NATO summit. Putin emphasized the preference for a political and diplomatic settlement in Ukraine, but taking into account Russia's fundamental approaches. But apparently, what Vladimir Putin told Donald Trump about the alleged superiority of the Russian Federation on the front, about the victories of the Russian Federation's armed forces, did not convince. Trump apparently didn't believe all that. And Vladimir Putin is under pressure, and the process of ending Russia's war against Ukraine is moving much faster than people think. This was a statement by Donald Trump made just a few hours before this episode was recorded. And according to the American president, despite the continued strikes on Ukrainian territory, the Russian side is allegedly looking for ways to end the fighting. Next, I'll quote Trump. I think Putin is still under pressure. He wants to put an end to this. Ukraine wants it too. And we are negotiating. We'll see if we can make it happen. It's a terrible situation, but I think this situation is much closer to being resolved than people realize. And President Putin wants it to end. And President Zelensky really wants this to end right now. We are going to reach out to NATO and we will discuss it. Trump also emphasized that he had a very successful call and believes that the parties are as close as possible to a final decision. And tomorrow in Ankara, Trump will hold talks with Zelensky, and then Trump will call Vladimir Putin. It's important everything happens in this exact order. And it's important to note that Trump has finally admitted that the pressure from Ukraine's defense forces is actually working, and Putin really is under pressure. And here, Russian war correspondents all went berserk at once and rushed to follow the Kremlin's new playbook. It seems that Vladimir Putin wants to show that he is ready to drastically raise the stakes and escalate this war. This is a classic intimidation tactic. This is about a new wave of mobilization in Russia. In the past couple of days, Russian pro-war Z channels have started actively writing about a possible new mobilization, which, according to these war correspondents, the Kremlin might launch right after the State Duma elections in September, to turn the tide at the front and respond to Ukraine's record series of drone attacks. Russian military blogger Vladimir Romanov even stated today that the Kremlin is preparing to mobilize 1,200,000 soldiers. Well, I don't know how realistic that is. And further, the pro-war channel Prizrak Novorossi writes that mobilization is not a question of if, but when, and links this prospect to the unfavorable dynamics of the fighting. And then the propagandists write, quote, the focus on encouraging volunteers to sign contracts objectively does not meet the needs of the front for a number of reasons, from the ratio of losses to the need to maintain more personnel than is currently available. Well, and here I should note that, according to the Institute of International Studies, in the first half of the year, recruitment for the war brought 27,000 people into the army every month, while at the same time Russia's frontline losses have already reached 34,000 people per month. Russia is recruiting fewer people than it's losing. Another channel called Diary of Intelligence claims that the Kremlin has held talks with the leadership of neighboring countries, including Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, to prevent a mass exodus of conscripts, as happened during the mobilization in 2022. Officially, the borders will remain open on paper, but it will become de facto impossible to leave Russia due to certain technical issues, increased controls, and other unofficial measures in neighboring countries. But, for example, the founder of the conflict intelligence team, Ruslan Leviev, doubts that Vladimir Putin will actually announce a full-scale mobilization, because this would require significant financial resources to form new units, as well as to equip and train them, and so on. Moreover, Leviev believes that such a step fundamentally will not lead to, as he put it, the unfreezing of the front line, which has hardly moved for a couple of years now. Therefore, experts suggest that the new wave of rumors about mobilization in Russia could be a signal to Europe that Vladimir Putin is supposedly really ready to escalate the war and attack NATO countries if they do not stop supporting Ukraine. But such signals are especially relevant ahead of the NATO summit. And here I would like to remind you that earlier Vladimir Putin publicly ordered his agencies to compile lists of countries involved in the war in Ukraine so that in the future, as he put it, responsible decisions could be made. And this is obviously also a threat to Europe and the warning aimed at reducing aid to Ukraine. Especially since the day before, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov stated that this is no longer a special military operation, but a full-scale war. And this war supposedly began at the moment when Europe did not turn a blind eye to Russia's brutal aggression against Ukraine, but helped Ukraine defend itself. Peskov says that from the moment they started helping Ukraine, that's when this war began. Before that, it was a special military operation, when Russia wanted to capture Kyiv in 3 days and so on. And it's also important to note that Europe is responding. Europe is already reacting to such provocations by Vladimir Putin quite promptly. Today, Finland, Germany, Denmark, Lithuania, and Norway announced that in the coming days they will begin receiving the Blocker naval mining system from the Finnish explosives manufacturer Forset. The deliveries are estimated at hundreds of millions of euros. The Finnish Defense Forces have already signed a framework agreement with Forset for the supply of systems to these 5 NATO countries. And here is the goal of this cooperation, quote, strengthening the naval defense of the Allies. Naval mines can be used in the waters of the Baltic Sea, where ports serve as key nodes for troop mobility and cargo delivery during military crises. To put it simply, they want to fence themselves off from the Russians at sea as well, by simply placing huge minefields to block their ships. And that's great news, because the Russians should be isolated wherever possible. Ideally, just pour concrete to build a huge fence, separate ourselves, and not even see what's happening in those swamps. Let them destroy themselves there. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.